My name is Brad Burns. I live in Maine, Falmouth, Maine, in America. And I'm from a town called Friendship, Maine, a really small fishing village. And it's where I grew up. Not a lot unlike here, not a lot unlike Blackville, really. And people worked there very close to natural resources. It was lobster fishing was the big thing there, just like the woods is here, woodworking. And so that's perhaps one of the things that has sort of endeared me to the Miramichi, is that it reminds me of some of the fabric of my childhood in that regard.
Yeah. Could you tell us a little bit about your background and how the Miramichi has come into your life and your relationship with the Miramichi?
And I wrote a book about this, actually, that touches on most of the points, called Closing the Season. And I discuss in it how I got up here. But I've always known a little bit about the Miramichi. In my files back in the 80s, I had some correspondence with Alex Mills when he was a lawyer and in real estate. Even though I didn't really do a lot of fishing for Atlantic salmon, did a very little, and I knew a tiny bit about the Miramichi, but fishing, my family were fishermen. My grandfather was a lobster fisherman, and he had been as a child, or since childhood, a ground fisherman. Fishing for haddock and cod in the Gulf of Maine, and in fact, he worked on a boat doing that when he was 15 years old. Going out on George's Bank. So I've always been a fisherman, and the fishing that we had in New England was for the best fishing we had was for striped bass, and so I became a striped bass fisherman as a kid, and then got much more serious about it after college and as a young adult, and I did a lot of it. I went all over the place, surf casting, and so I got, in the U.S. we had a crash in the striped bass population that occurred in the 1970s and went on into the 1980s. And I was in my 20s, but I remember it very well. And it tore apart a lot of the community. I mean, the people in Chesapeake Bay that had fished for those fish commercially, they were put out of business. People that had fished for them their whole lives, all of a sudden there weren't any striped bass, and it was quite an adjustment for a lot of people. And so as a young guy, I got involved, or got dragged into the conservation end of it. And I had a friend, Wes Ayers, who passed away in the middle of it all, but he was involved in striped bass conservation, and I was to some degree his protege, and so we had a real battle to try to bring in conservation strategies and conservation-oriented bag limits and size limits and things, and for striped bass, because there was a commercial fishing industry that didn't want to give an inch. They had been doing it their way for a long time. And that was a big fight, and when the striped bass came back, which happened started in the late 80s and really went, they came back a lot in the 90s, it all of a sudden became this great fishery again, this world-class fishery, due to these conservation efforts. And we tried to solidify those and make them sort of a permanent way of doing things. One of those was to make striped bass a game fish and stop commercial fishing for striped bass. And we were not able to do that. As the fishery recovered, the politicians gave the fish back to the commercial fishermen to a very large degree. And just sort of validating what I'm talking about, today the striped bass population in the U.S. has crashed again. And all these draconian measures have now been put in place again, and it's just, we made the same mistakes all over again. But right in the middle of it, in the very early 2000s, as these fights were going on. It was exhausting, really. You know, I mean, I spent a lot of time at that, and lobbying people and raising money for conservation efforts, and I was introduced to the Miramichi through a friend of mine, Rip Cunningham, who was a publisher of Saltwater Sportsman magazine, and I'd known him for a long time, and we fished together in the ocean off of Cape Cod and Martha's Vineyard and things. And so he brought me up here fishing, and I thought, wow, this is really, I loved it, you know. And not only did I like the river and the culture, but well, that is it, I guess. It was the culture of it. At the Miramichi, now they'd been through their own conservation battles, which I hadn't really been part of. I had heard about them a little bit. But the Miramichi that I arrived at in 2003 was one that was recovering. You know, there were more salmon, and bigger salmon because of the things that had been done. And everybody was on that page. That's what they wanted. There was no fight with commercial fishing anymore. It was known that you couldn't have a commercial fishery for them in the Miramichi. And it was all about conservation and better fishing, and I thought, boy, what a breath of fresh air, you know. And so here, unlike in fishing for striped bass back home, you had to stay up all night to catch big striped bass, you know, surf casting or going out in a boat in the ocean, here you could wade along in knee-deep water and cast with a floating line, a small fly, and have the ability to catch a big fish, you know. And not only a big fish, but so much has been written about Atlantic salmon, you know, the great fish, you know, the one that Ted Williams said everybody wants to catch, right? And so I thought, here's this fish, this wonderful fish that you can catch in this aesthetically pleasing way, and that's what everybody wants to do. That's the way it's going, and it was such a pleasant thing, you know, that it just won me over, you know, and that's what I wanted to do.
Was that your first experience with fly fishing?
No, I was a fly fisherman. I'd been fly fishing for I didn't grow up fly fishing. I grew up fishing with a hand line, you know, and then it was spin fishing and bait casting in our surf casting days, and trolling tackle and different things for striped bass. But I got involved with fly fishing in the mid 1980s, late 1980s. No, earlier than that. Early 1980s. We had striped bass off the beaches in Maine that were hard to catch, and they were feeding. I could see they were feeding on these small sand eels, these thin sand eels. And I thought, well, how can I duplicate that, you know? And I thought, well, a fly rod. So I went to LL Bean and bought a fly rod. As everybody had one in those days, these Fenwick fiberglass rods, you know, the brown fiberglass rods. And I just got into it, and I did all kinds of fly fishing. I went tarpon fishing down in Florida, and I did a lot of fishing in Labrador for brook trout. And then I started fly fishing for striped bass in Maine's Kennebec River. And so by the time I came up here, I had 20 years of serious fly fishing effort, you know, under my belt. And so, anyway.
No, that's very interesting. His book, From Maine to Montauk, explains very well that evolution in chasing striped bass, and you touch
Right.
on your early years with the Miramichi, and that's a fascinating read, Brad. Can you tell us about the first salmon you caught, where you were, and the fly you were using, please?
The first salmon I caught was on a place called the Big River in Labrador. It wasn't the Miramichi. I got invited on a trip up there with some of my friends that were salmon fishermen. And I would say that they were typical of what I knew of salmon fishermen. They were guys that would make 1 or 2 trips a year to these because there was no fishing locally in Maine. So all Maine, all U.S. salmon fishermen are travel fishermen. You know, you don't have a local striped, salmon fishery like you do here. And they would go somewhere. The most serious of them would go 2 or 3 times to some place. And the big river is a river on the coastal Labrador, just north of Goose Bay, and I caught some grills. We saw some large salmon jump, but mostly what I caught were grills. And it was nice. It was a lot of fun. It was a traditional lodge sort of experience. You'd have a big breakfast, and then you'd go out with the guide, and you'd fish your little section of the river, and then in the evening you'd fish again, and you'd have drinks and a big dinner, and it was fun. But it wasn't the experience that I had here, really. It wasn't what really, because I did that, and I went on a number of those trips after that to a number of locations. And I went to Iceland with another guy, and those were all good experiences, but they did not bring me into salmon fishing the way that the Miramichi did. And with the Miramichi, I had a different relationship with it. Rather than just come up here for a week, and stay at some lodge, it was much more of a grassroots thing. Even the Blackbrook Salmon Club, which is quite a nice place, it was still a club owned by the guys that I was going there with. And so anyway, once I bought a piece of property here and started fishing with people that had lived here their whole lives, and got out on the river, and it was a different experience. And also, of course, we had some fairly large salmon, and so as opposed to catching grills, all of a sudden I was catching 15 and 20 pound Atlantic salmon, and they are really a fabulous, there's no better fighting fish on earth than Atlantic salmon.
You have written wonderful books about the Miramichi and the Cairns River and your experiences here. You've told us a little bit about what makes it special. Can you tell us about some of the other feelings and how you find the Miramichi and the Cairns very special to you? Because you've invested a lot of your own time and energy in researching the history, the culture, the people that have lived here for a number of generations.
Yeah, it was funny too, because when I wrote on the Cairns especially, I started researching that by Googling up things and getting a little bit of information, and that would lead to more. Everything has got a bibliography, and so you would start digging into all these things. And it's hard to put into words what it is about something that captivates you, and every time somebody does, they end up sounding syrupy about it, and I don't want to do that. I want to try to be as objective as I can. For me to be enthralled with the history of the deeds of certain men that I never knew, and that I don't really have a lot in common with in some ways. In some ways I do, I suppose. It seems odd, I suppose, even to me a little bit. But I became just sort of fascinated by some of what, and the history. One of the things about these rivers, the Cairns and the Miramichi, is that the history is very recent. We're not talking 1400s here, there was really nobody here in terms of English-speaking people until the middle 1800s, or pretty close to it. There were some earlier than that. But for a while, the province gave me the access to the software. Now I guess it's much more accessible, but a few years ago they gave me access to the software that showed all the Crown grants and who had them, and at the same time they gave me access for a limited time to the software that showed the deeds, and that also showed the wills and last testaments of these people and so forth. So you could learn a lot about what happened. As an example, one of the great people of the river was this man, Harry Allen, who came from over near Fredericton. And he started taking people fishing down the river. And people from everywhere got to know this guy. I mean, he made tours of the United States promoting his business, and so there were several books and smaller papers and things written about fishing trips with him. And he was not a really old man when he died, 72 years old, in 1932, and he smoked himself to death, essentially, died of cancer. And I take that back. I'm not sure that it was cancer. It may have been just it may have been a heart attack in the end, but he had cardiovascular issues the last of his life. And when he died, he left the property that is now was Wade's Fishing Lodge to Charlie Wade, who was his. Charlie Wade was the son of one of his sisters, and he left the property that became Blackbrook Salmon Club, Allen Brothers, to that was his family, Allen, to another. He was never married, to another one of his brother's children, and he had learned these various properties that were great fishing properties, like the one that became Seabury Stanton's camp. He had that. He had a right of first refusal or something on that land. There was no camp there at that time. And probably what I found to be the most fascinating thing of all was that he was involved in what was probably the first property sale on the Canes River for the salmon fishing rights. They had the Arbo pool on the upper part of the Canes Road, sort of the middle of the Canes River, about 30 miles up from the mouth. And he sold it to a guy from New York that was one of his customers. And they bought that for the fishing, because that was a great salmon pool at the time. Turns out that there was never a Crown grant on the property, and so the guy never did have any private fishing. But I don't think he ever got there anyway. There's no record even now of him selling it. I think he just abandoned it, and the province took it back as they did. But anyway, some of those deeds to go down the Canes River in a canoe and to see the pools that people fished 100, 150 years ago, and